record. Let me answer that question with a bit of an analogy. I think that not too long ago in the 90s, we Bermudians convinced ourselves that Bermuda was like a 747 airline, cruising at 35,000 feet, and that the airline was on autopilot. It really didn't matter who was up there on the flight deck. Instead, we decided to concentrate on the cabin. In other words, who was going to sit in the economy, who was going to sit in business class, and who was going to sit in first class. Yeah. Okay? And that worked out fine for a while because we were flying the friendly skies. But the moment we hit turbulence, we discovered that this plane is not on autopilot. And it does matter who's up there in the flight deck. And the pilot and the co-pilot that we have done a remarkably poor job during this time of turbulence. Matter of fact, the plane has lost a lot of altitude and a lot of speed. So, we need to be concentrating on flying this plane, not on rearranging who's going to sit first class, business class, and economy. Because if that plane crashes, my friend, everybody's in jeopardy, no matter where you're sitting on the plane.
So what does she need to do differently?
Well, unfortunately, you know, she needs to start to listen to some of the things that we've been saying all this time. It's a bit late in the day to adopt my mantra of living within your means, but it's not too late. But just that the medicine is going to be much more bad tasting than it would have been if you'd done it 4 or 5 years ago.
Can I just say one thing, and I think it's important that I don't think people realize that the finance minister has the greatest responsibility and the greatest role. And we seem to think that the finance minister sort of sits back, but in the government, the finance minister has control. That person has, if you will, the number one, the most power, and we must remember that. Thank you.
Well, not only that, the finance minister is the co-pilot in this case. So I think that living within their means is critical. Also, the tenets that we have laid down about the budgeting process. This government also needs to really learn themselves up insofar as reading the tea leaves of economic cycles. I mean, they have just blown it. And you know what? We've had, particularly in the part of some of the leaders, a blatant attempt to mislead Bermudians as to what's going to happen here. And that's one thing that I've tried to do, is to tell the truth as I see it, whether it's pretty or ugly.
They say you act like you've got a crystal ball.
Yeah, well, that's what they say to make light of it, right? Nobody has a crystal ball, but at the same time, you know, we can predict things in economics just like we can predict when hurricanes are coming. Not 100%, but you can give people a pretty good idea, and that's what we do.
I think also we've been faulted for having expertise in finance and maybe not as much in some other areas. So if we have that expertise, then you should listen to us, because we know what we've been talking about. In the past, our history has been in developing finance, developing and making sure that Bermuda was fiscally strong.
You had mentioned projects for construction workers that are unemployed. You mentioned the hospital. What other projects would you recommend, and how would you make sure that Bermudians were hired?
Well, here's the problem. The problem is that, you know, in a perfect world, we have a lot of other projects that we can do. The causeway can be rebuilt. I think all of us in Bermuda know that the roads in Bermuda are in the worst condition they've been in 20 years. So, you know, we can rebuild roads. We can do a lot of things. The question is where you get the money from. And it's the money that is the constraint. And I am certainly not going to recommend that we increase the public debt by some astronomical amount just to put Bermudians back to work. I think that we really have to look at the kind of control and the kind of intelligence in terms of what's going on in the labor markets that this government has. Because this wide swing that we've had in government policy indicates to me that you know, they don't seem to know what's going on in the labor markets in Bermuda, where one hand people are hiring foreigners willy-nilly, and then the next hand, on the next day, all of a sudden we are saying, well, you can't bring in any, right? And by the way, all of a sudden we discovered that there are these unemployed Bermudians. So we've got to have a government that's more in tune to what's actually happening on the ground, so that we can make more intelligent and precise policies that will encourage business development and therefore encourage jobs. But I said, I am not going to stand here and say that, you know, we should borrow another $300 or $400 million to initiate projects to help the unemployment problem, because you have to calibrate this thing properly. And you know, if you start a lot of projects, then all of a sudden you're going to have this big demand for foreign labor. You see what I'm saying? So it's something that requires a great deal of calibration, and what I'm seeing so far indicates to me that that kind of calibration isn't there. And so we need to really be very much more careful as to our intelligence as to what's happening on the ground.
But I think what Bob would also say is the fact that if you can save money in government spending rather than borrowing, that's the opportunity for government to have money to use on some of these necessary projects. Agree?
I agree.
And what about hotel workers as well? Is there concern there since they took the pay freeze beginning of the year? They haven't seen an increase in cost of living reflecting in their paychecks. Are you expecting that to be a huge problem for the future with all these hotel workers plus the construction workers out of business?
Well, I think that the government is going to have to continue with that situation. Unfortunately, as I mentioned in my prepared remarks, all their deductions are not being frozen, right? Their healthcare reductions are increasing, so they're still facing a situation of declining disposable income. The situation in the hotel sector is particularly egregious in this area. They're facing a whole set of combined negative factors, and you know, I'm hoping, and let me make it clear, I am hoping that at least one of these hotel projects that have been talked about actually comes to pass. We really need that. I have been skeptical, publicly so, about whether or not it does happen. But it would be really welcome if somebody, either Mr. Bazarian down there in St. George's, or the people up here in Hamilton in the Parlerville project, or the Lantana one, start to say, you know, we've got it all together and we're going to break ground tomorrow. Because that would be a good thing. Because, you know, government can't create all of these projects themselves. Can't do it. Don't have the money. So one of the other things they can do is to try to move these projects forward. But there's been a reluctance in the capital markets to finance these kinds of things. So there's really a structural problem here. And I wish I could stand up here in front of you and say I know what the answer is. I don't. But I think we have to recognize in Bermuda that there is a structural problem, and no amount of PR or advertising or anything like that is going to solve that problem. This is a problem of the economic model of hotels in Bermuda. That is the problem. The economic model is broken, and so, you know, you can throw all kinds of advertising. You know, you can put Bermuda on streetcars in Toronto all you like. I mean, that's a great idea. You know, I used to live in Toronto. Put streetcars in Toronto all you like, but you know, it's not going to build any new hotels. So we have to take a very close look at the economic model of hotels in Bermuda and what we need to do to make it better, because right now it's broken. Anybody else? I've talked you to the ground.